Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us at Vologys WireSide Chats. I'm your host, Neil Teresiano. Today's topic is going to be on converged infrastructure. It's going to be part of a four-part series. First one's going to be a high overview, 50,000-foot view of convergence. We're going to define it and talk about some of the ways that an IT department might apply that into their infrastructure. And then the other three are going to be with some of what Vologys finds to be key players in the convergence universe, so to speak. So if I may, let me take a moment to introduce you to a few of our subject matter experts. One of them you may have met before, the world famous and quite possibly the world's most beautiful engineer, Kevin Reynolds. Kevin, how are you today?
I'm fantastic, Neil. Eddie didn't put all the big bright lights shining directly in my face today, so I'm very, very happy about that.
We're just as happy.
So
also who joins me is the world's busiest director at Vologys. I may have offended a few directors at Vologys with that one, but I know that Dan Patrick is a very busy man. Dan, thank you for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about what you do here at Vologys?
Thanks, Neil. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Dan Patrick. I'm the Director of Technical Services here at Vologys, and I pretty much run our field engineering teams that focus on networking, virtualization, and storage every single day. So I'm excited to be a part of this amazing new technology conversation that we're having today.
That's great. Dan joins us. Dan, you've been with us for how long now?
I joined Vologys about the beginning of March, so it's about 5 months. But in Vologys time, that's dog years. So let's see, it's at least 2 years now. So we kind of work what we call intergalactic days around here. They last 37 hours, and that's because we're doing whatever it takes for our customers every single day.
Yes, certainly. I know I've spent countless hours in your office with Kevin as well, doing a lot of really neat stuff for our customers. So we're excited to get this thing moving as we get to our new era of Vologys, right?
Absolutely.
So what I wanted to do was just sort of start off with a simple understanding or definition of convergence, right? Because we can talk about convergence in a lot of ways. What we've got to be careful about is whether we're using a marketing term or a buzzword or what we actually mean, right? So what I wanted to do was at least go over the definition of convergence. That part at least remains the same, which is essentially bringing many parts to one, right? So that's all really convergence is. Now we've got a lot of things that we're going to talk about here in the next 50 minutes or so that will give us into a little bit more of the detail, and of course by default we're going to end up going down a few paths that will lead to the marketing term, but in the end it's all leading to the same place, right? Hence the word to converge. And if I may move on, we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the things that convergence tends to resolve as well, right? As we move through this, we're going to talk about how convergence provides value, what the stated value of convergence is, as well as some of the things that some of the manufacturers out there, especially the disruptive ones, are sort of changing the way that we do IT. So essentially, some of the major things that we talk about with convergence or the problems we solve are they reduce sprawl, which we're going to have Kevin comment on here in a moment. And then there's also the reduced cost of management because things become a little simpler. And then there's also the other piece where we can gain some function, both in the amount of space that the gear takes, where we can end up doing more with less, essentially. Again, a byproduct of convergence. And more importantly, I think from a business perspective, for the business owners out there, the increased agility that it gives an IT department, an ability for you to essentially consume any other form of business and turn them on or turn them up almost immediately, or change the direction of your business or even change your strategy without ripping and replacing an entire data center. So let's go back to the first piece, which is sprawl. Kevin, I think you're probably a good person. I think every day you battle sprawl, right? Dan, I'm sure you battle a little sprawl yourself. I think we've recently had an engagement where we had customers with somewhere around 30 or 40 different vendors that were sitting in their rack. That's an old problem now, right? Right, Kevin? So how would you describe the problem of sprawl, and how does convergence solve that for a customer?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as sprawl is concerned, in a traditional physical server model, so you had server after server. Each physical piece of hardware had its kind of own purpose and or role, and then of course you have to accommodate for the for the battery backup and the additional switching capacity, so forth and so on. So intro virtualization, and that has actually reduced that footprint somewhat. However, you still have all of your disparate systems, right? So you've got your compute and RAM nodes, and then you've got your storage, and then you've got your SAN fabric, and then your everything has to be presented out to the LAN, right? So you still have all of these different systems that still need to be brought together, and again, that's still taking up RU space, and that's drawing power and requiring cooling, et cetera, et cetera. So in theory, or at its rudimentary level, convergence is really just combining all of your compute node, your storage, software-defined networking, kind of put it all together onto one box and present everything virtually up to the hypervisor so that you can carve it out as necessary. So that's really the definition of convergence, is taking all of those different aspects or facets of the data center that we needed to accommodate for, and combining them into a single kind of box product that is extremely scalable and makes it a lot easier to provision additional hardware to add on to the mesh and to grow your infrastructure.
So do you think that it's hard to measure, right? I mean, how much sprawl will cost in a business to run? I mean, do you have some examples or of some customers where sprawl's sort of gotten away from them, and you can sort of see what's happening as far as how expensive it's getting, and it even changes the way you buy gear, right? I mean, it becomes reactionary.
Absolutely. And so as new initiatives come in, all of a sudden as we're planning and provisioning for additional RU space that we're going to need, data center capacity, et cetera, we don't always necessarily know what new initiatives are going to be brought down the pipe, right? And so if we're not careful, especially in a non-converged type infrastructure, it can make planning for that potential growth very difficult, right? Whereas with a converged infrastructure model, they're all very boltable Lego block type units. So as you need to grow, you have this anticipated growth. You know approximately what it's going to be, and so you can just provision the hardware in a single box or an N+1 type model to be ready for you when it comes time to actually start provisioning those new server environments.
So it sounds like we're going to the next point, right, which was about agility. That's something I think that has been difficult. Again, it's difficult to measure. So Dan, I think we're going to point this one at you. I think you deal with more C-suite than the rest of us, and you probably have some good insight on the value that agility can bring to any IT director or CIO that's looking to improve things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, agile IT and having IT bring value to the business is really kind of the core goal of almost any modern day IT director or CIO or even CTO, right? They're really looking for ways to enable the business, with both within the data center and out in the cloud, obviously, right? And so, one of the newer ways to think about or sort of build on new capabilities is something like converged. In the past, if there was a new workload that would come along that a CTO or a CIO would want to put in place, it would be a very long project cycle to get from concept through an entire design, and kind of just talking about what Kevin was hitting on in terms of rack space and power and network switching capabilities, storage, all these things that really have to come together in order to produce an IT service, which is really what the business is interested in, right? They're interested in the service that will enable their business to grow. All of those things are very difficult, and with with Converged, you really can bolt on workloads that you don't feel like need to go to the cloud today very quickly, right? The cloud seems like the answer, the end-all be-all answer to everything these days, but it's not true. There's data that you want to keep in-house. You have privacy, regulatory, all different types of things that keep you from enabling new new workloads, enabling you to be agile. But Converge really brings that into play, especially in scenarios like business intelligence, and even virtual desktops, right? Where if you don't have a virtual desktop infrastructure, if you were going to start from scratch to build that, you would have to go and create that entire infrastructure. With something like Converged, you basically could very quickly choose the the number of desktops that you want to put in place. Work with a company like Vologys to find the right solution for you, and we can have it in your data center extremely quickly. We of course could help with the other piece, but it wouldn't be nearly as fast, and ultimately wouldn't hit those core goals of being agile. So, and the one other thing is it really does allow for the collapse of vendors, right? So the less number of vendors that anyone has to deal with IT, the faster they're going to be able to turn a service on or enable some new business process through a system. So I really think that Converged is almost the answer for agile IT, especially when the answer is it has to be as fast as cloud, but it can't be in the cloud.
And I think that's it's really a good insight. The ability to make adjustments has always been a problem for IT, right, Dan? I mean, any given moment, your COO can come in and make a drastic change that from the non-technical side of things. And if there's any IT folks listening, we've all heard of this, right? We've all been through this. Well, we just need to go ahead and stand up a shopping cart, or we need to just spin up a website, or I just bought a huge company, I need them on board in 4 days. Not that easy to do, right?
Yeah, and that's actually, when I was talking about, something like, bootstrapping, a very important workload that needs great compute, it needs speed, it needs lots of space, but you're dealing with your constraints no matter what the business or the executives or the marketing, the marketplace throws in front of you, right? And you think about being able to really, I mean, it's easy to install a server, right? It's easy to install some of this stuff. What isn't easy is backing it up, managing it, DRing it, doing all of these things. And some of these technologies that we're going to talk about today really allow for not only rapid acquisition and installation, but also everything else that goes along with making sure that the thing is available, that you can do continuity of business on it, and do load balancing across any data center worldwide. So it's a compelling technology. It's probably one of the most disruptive technologies really that we've seen since virtualization in the client server space that has come to light, and it's an exciting topic to be talking about, and it's a great opportunity for IT directors, for CTOs to have rapid answers to difficult questions that are placed in front of them every day.
You said something, you called it a technology, right? And it really is a sort of technology, and maybe if we, gives us an opportunity to sort of segue into something else, which is differentiating the practice of convergence, right, and a convergence product, right? Both, very valuable in their own right. But I think that it's important, Dan, and maybe you can kind of help us understand, the practice of convergence versus a converged product, right? I mean,
sure.
One is sort of a turnkey solution, essentially, right, that's set up and ready to go, and the other one is a design practice, right? Could you give us a little color on that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to realize that convergence is both. It is both a strategy in terms of your design, but it's also it's becoming new products that are in the marketplace. And so the idea of anything converged is really the direction that everyone should be heading. And so if you look at not only the products and the vendors that are kind of traditional out there, and we'll talk about those in just a second. They're pretty interesting, but I think that more than anything, what you need is you need a partner like Vology, if I can give ourselves a plug here for a second, that really is kind of at the forefront of the converged space. We've really jumped into the deep end of the pool with converged space. We think that it's a very important shift in the marketplace, and because of that, we're gearing up. We're doing converged on our own network. We're rolling it out to all different kinds of networks in places where it makes sense to do that. And so, having a great firm like Vology to help you is of course one of the most important things that can help you be successful. But using the traditional design principles, around virtualization, from those pretty quickly you can jump into building converged designs, using virtual storage arrays and getting creative with how you put together your virtualization clusters and try to replace some of the traditional vendors and some of the software spend that you might have had to make the solution work, get it through that last mile. To really give you the promise that virtualization had, is possible and important with traditional vendors like HP or Dell. But then there's also more of the turnkey solution providers such as SimpliVity. SimpliVity is a fantastic group that we've been working very closely with. We've got two of our most senior engineers actually out there working with some of their team this week to help us to try to bring forward the right solutions on top of the SimpliVity platform, where you're bringing storage, compute, everything in one box. That's a turnkey solution. And then we also have other vendors like Nutanix, which have sort of each one of these kind of have different design things that they're better at, if you will. But Nutanix is also an interesting player in the converged space. Actually using the Google file system. So, it's not only a design concept of building something converged with your traditional enterprise providers like HP and Dell, but then we have the new players out in the marketplace that Vology can help you with through SimpliVity or Nutanix.
That's great. So, and Dan, I appreciate you kind of going over that. We were going to ask you, who you thought the big players were, and coincidentally, those are the people that we're going to have on the show over the next few sessions that are going to be on this topic of converged infrastructure, and it sort of all falls under the umbrella of virtualization, to your point, Kevin. So, I think that what I'd like to do at this point is, maybe go to our next question that I believe is probably one of the more important ones, right? The one, and Dan, I'm going to point this one at you again since we have you. As far as costs go, right? Operation costs, or OpEx, is sort of a term we use loosely in the business. TCO, another one, right? Total cost of ownership. These things are affected by convergence, right? The practice of convergence, whether it's a converged product or a converged solution is presented by a reseller. Are there some ways that you can maybe delineate that a customer or an end user might experience some of the lower costs or the savings that are associated with it?
Yeah, so when we think of operational costs, and this is clearly something that's really important, especially not only for IT directors, but really when we're talking about justifying new products or new projects, if you will, and we think about the total number of man hours and software and vendors, and you wrap it all together. I think this is one of the places where the converged infrastructure players really have an interesting story. First of all, you really are lowering the number of vendors that you're potentially using, right? Inside of say a SimpliVity solution, you're going to have obviously the compute and the virtualization piece that's brought into play with VMware as a part of that. But then there's also disaster recovery built into it, and it comes with the machine. You have WAN acceleration and data duplication that are just a native part of the actual box, as well as auto tiering of data around inside of the machine. All those things that I just threw out there that sound like technologies are actually huge cost savings for you, right? If you were to say license, a virtual storage array for a box like that, it would cost you software dollars, and you may have an extra vendor that you would have to go to, muddling the waters for, support costs, acquisition costs in terms of how much time it takes you to get through a process to actually, purchase that. And so, I think that, and also backup software as well. What ends up happening is you sort of have to take into account all of those costs, and you're boiling it down to only having, say, you went from 5 or 6 vendors to only one vendor. That's a huge cost savings. It's a huge time savings, right? The next thing for me, really, in terms of operational costs is rapid escalation of support issues. I worked at Microsoft for 15 years in support, and one of the things that really hurt customers the most that I saw was there was always conflicts in terms of which vendor do I really talk to. Is it an HP problem, or is it a Microsoft problem, or is it a this problem or that problem? If you have a storage, you have a converged solution, what ends up happening is you're talking to one vendor. You don't have an issue of do I need to call the server group, or do I call whoever I bought my SAN from, or do I call who I bought my virtualization software? It's all sort of together in one support package, and that's a huge savings just in terms of how many times have all of us had to re-explain an issue when you called into the queue to some support vendor. So just that in of itself, restoring service, working with vendors, the less number of vendors. And I do want to go back to one other piece that I just talked about, just the inherent benefits of, in the past, you may have thought on your network, wow, we really need WAN acceleration, or we need, better DR software. Just the simple fact that, when you make that core converged solution purchase and it's productized, then, you get that as a part of what you bought. That could be a significant change, especially for our customers that are more in the mid-market or smaller markets that are worried about cost, but they really need those benefits. If they can't restore something or get their service back online, they may go out of business. And so even though it may sometimes, when you look at a conversion solution on the face of it, it seems like it's a bit more expensive. The truth is there's so much inherent value there that ultimately the costs are really much lower.
And that really rings true, right? It's just, I think, what is probably one of the most important things that we could do as a trusted advisor to any end user is to help articulate, the value that we can bring. And when there's a total cost of ownership reduction that really reaches out into the other silos, like you had mentioned things about software, and Kevin, you had mentioned some reduced power costs, and then Dan, you mentioned some manageability. In we'll call them the old days, even though it's kind of like today. We had an EMC professional that would work on the EMC silo, but that probably wasn't the only SAN we had. We may have had a NetApp box that was doing our file services, right? And that might be a different professional working that, and then we have someone else that's working the servers, and then of course someone that's working the networking side, and then a security person, and these are all silos that are sort of disparate, and it becomes very difficult to manage it. And I think one of the biggest pain points, and if there's a single IT person on this watching right now, you've heard it, Dan, you hit home. We've all dealt with it. We'll call one vendor and find out that we need cooperation with another vendor, and then those vendors need to open tickets with each other just so that the three of us can get on the phone. And it's just the nature of the beast, and we can all understand why it's so necessary. You have no idea what effect something may have on your product. So I think it's a very good, very important point to make, and it's very hard to measure. So it's very important that we get better at articulating that to the directors and to the CIOs of the world that make those decisions on whether or not they want to invest in our network. One big investment that's coming again, another buzzword, big data, right? I find, in my opinion, very, very closely related to business intelligence. Most big data, is sort of the destination or target for business intelligence, and our ability to pull valuable information out of incredible amounts of data has become more and more of an issue. And it's interesting how it's turned from, it's not necessarily a problem, but there's gold in there, and we've got to get better at finding that. But again, it's a new thing. Big data is huge. How do I design something for big data? How do I change where I'm going? Do I get with my EMC person, my NetApp person, my server person? Do you see, Dan, a value for convergence as it relates to some of these newer issues in IT too? Right? Outside of Agile IT, there's of course this big data piece. Do you see some value there? Do you see that it could be sort of a solution for some of us in the mid-market to smaller enterprise market?
Yeah, definitely. I think that before I came to Vology, I was actually in charge of running a big data infrastructure for a consulting firm, and one of the interesting things about it is a lot of people think big data and they immediately think cloud. They think, oh, well, I need to be Amazon, or it needs to be run in Windows, SQL Azure or something like that. And really the point about any sort of data project, whether it's data mining or BI or big data, it's really more about what's the outcome, right? How do I change the business? And then also, how approachable is it for me, as you said, say the mid-market. And a lot of times, customers or companies will go down the path of looking into a big data solution, or trying to get more interesting around business intelligence. And what they find is that their infrastructure doesn't support it, but cloud isn't performant enough, right? I definitely saw that in the projects that I was working on, where you want answers fast and now, especially when you've got some decent data scientists, and the cloud isn't necessarily performant. Big data doesn't mean fast data, right?
Right.
And that's a big difference that most people kind of miss. The other thing is I actually like to focus on what we called smart data, right? And smart data was really about, how do I make the correlations across lots of different disparate systems or disparate, methodologies in order to come up with something that is a force multiplier for my business, right? And so when I look at a solution like a converged solution, it works perfectly for a big data, smart data, in-house type of solution. It has decent sized data volumes, and the easily 20T is very approachable for not much money, as well as it has an auto-tiering VSA typically involved, where it will move data around, right, up into Flash for large indexing, and for things like NoSQL, Cassandra, and other types of technologies where you're doing all different types of data approaches. So the way I look at it is big data should be smart data for you, and converged is a way to not only put your toe in the water for it, but it's a way to jump into the deep end of the pool without needing to do it all in the cloud, right? And so it definitely is interesting.
So and that's a good point. And smart. I think we may have to coin the smart data piece, because essentially it's sort of navigating a sea of otherwise useless and out of context information in order to find something that's useful. And I think from a design perspective, what we find to be the bigger issue is a lot of us are approaching this, but we don't know how to design for it. We don't know how much compute we might need in order to do the indexing that we need, in order to find the information that we don't want or that we do want. And convergence does offer that opportunity, right? It's since it is converged, the ability for us to make adjustments, right? If we find that we need a little more compute, we spin up maybe a couple more virtual machines that'll assist in that, right? Or maybe if we need to make some changes to those virtual machines, we can just provision additional memory for those machines. And so even the smallest of those that have a big data need, convergence brings that piece as well, right? Where it gives them the opportunity. And you know, one of the things that we hear a lot from customers where we sort of get on our soapbox about the value of convergence is a fear of putting all your eggs in one basket, right? I mean, this is the next thought, right? We want to be careful. We want to worry about things like, what if someone pulls the plug? What happens? And we're talking about bringing everything into, you know, just 2 data centers instead of 15, you know, distributed data centers. That the old style of best practices is being challenged here, right, Kevin? So what I want to ask you is, we spin up all of these virtual machines. I've got my security, and I've got my file services and my Active Directory and a lot of other virtual machines. They're all spun up in this converged solution. So is there a real issue here? Is there the inherent risks? And I want you to touch on 2 things. Touch on the eggs in a basket concern, which I think is a reasonable first reaction to it. Mm-hmm. And then, are we revealing any opportunities for some security concerns? And I mean all the way from the perimeter to inside and email.
Sure. So you know, that question kind of ties in directly to Dan's point about converged infrastructure really being more than just taking all the different hardware technologies and stuffing them into a single box, right? Oftentimes there's a lot more going on at the software layer as well. So we're using technologies like software auto tiering and virtualizing storage, including SSDs and spinning disk, in order to create different zones. Excuse me. So to that point, again, the converged infrastructures are doing a lot more at the software layer as well. One of those things that they're doing is actually meshing and kind of, we'll use the term rating themselves for redundancy and resiliency, right? So naturally, yes, it would be a concern to say, okay, well, you know, so I've taken my switching and my fiber channel and my compute and my storage, and I've put it all onto the same box, and so, well, what happens, right? Well, just like anything else, we're architecting these solutions so that they have redundancy built in. You essentially build in an N+1 model for your converged infrastructure solution, so that if you were to lose, you know, up to a single node, up to an entire node, the rest of the solution, the rest of the actual hardware, the converged boxes, are talking to each other, and there's a certain mesh there, right? So they're aware of the issues with that node, and they can pick up the workload. You know, again, very similar to the way you know, a RAID array allows you to fail a drive, and it can still be aware of the fact that that drive has failed and pick up on the redundancy factor and keep your data safe, right? So you architect the solution with the redundancy built in that you need. And again, oftentimes it's as simple as an N+1 model, and therefore all the eggs in one basket is not really a concern, because maybe we have all of our eggs in baskets. Maybe the baskets look exactly the same and they kind of do the same effect, but we've built those baskets to be large enough to contain the entirety of the eggs, even if we should lose one of them.
Right. So essentially, you know, what you're saying is that convergence actually provides the opposite. It provides us maybe with something even more resilient than your typical, even if we go pre-virtualization, you know, if we have a bunch of physical boxes, I think in comparison to that, would you argue that an appropriately designed converged infrastructure may reveal some higher availability than your typical disparate siloed approach?
You know, I wouldn't necessarily that inherently the technologies provide for more high availability or more redundancy, but it certainly can provide the same level of redundancy, if not more so, in a much simpler and less complex fashion, right? So it again, not to say that it's more redundant than the ways that we would have done it in the past, but it's certainly less convoluted than the ways we would have had to do it in the past in order to maintain the same levels of redundancy.
Okay, and on security, do you think it changes at all when it comes to from perimeter to anything on the inside that we're doing, or even some of the application layer firewall stuff that we're doing? Do you see maybe a weakness that's being revealed, or do you feel that maybe we're adding some capabilities in that regard?
So in my experience, and inevitably there's always going to be someone to argue with that, right? But in my experience, the technologies that are providing the security, they're not necessarily impacted by the fact that we are converging the infrastructure or what we are doing at the software layer as far as the virtual machines are concerned. So all your same security parameters are still in place, all of your perimeter security and your NTFS permissions, right down to what you can do at the network layer as far as VLANing and as far as routing is concerned. All of those functionalities are still there. So, again, in my opinion, in my experience, I don't really see that convergence necessarily presents any additional security risks. It doesn't necessarily inherently shore up security any tighter either. You still have to be diligent of all of your security aspects, but again, it's not really presenting any additional security holes to the infrastructure or to the environment.
So, Dan, I've got one for you.
Sure.
In your infinite wisdom, I think you have maybe 50 years in IT, right?
That's great. Man, I feel like it sometimes.
This isn't your first rodeo. I think you've been through a few implementations. I know that in your former life, it's quite possible we could count them in maybe even 4 or 5 digits, considering the at some level, some way or shape or form you've been involved. So you might be the best guy for us to go to on this one. What do you think? What do you think the big concern is? What do you think the after a CI implementation occurs? Give us sort of the beginning and after that, an IT a director or even a CIO that's considering it. And I'm wrapping a few questions up in one on this one. What comes to mind when the implementation process, or what words of wisdom do you have for those of us that are considering implementing it, so that we don't get stuck in I didn't think about that moment? And then, where do we usually find these customers afterwards? Because, whether we like it or not, right? How do they feel? So what's the converged? What does that make them, a customer, feel like afterwards? Essentially, in your and we know what the answer is. It's rhetorical. So if you could maybe start off on the beginning on that one and tell us, what are your words of wisdom on it?
I think that the one thing I would say that is really important, and this is something that's always really important, but it may be more important here than in other types of deployments, is making sure that, especially if you go with a converged solution product, right, like a Nutanix or the SimpliVity product, you want to make sure that you've properly trained the people that are doing the engineering and the people that are going to run the operations, right? And I know that goes without saying. We always harp on training, but at the same time, it's one of the first things that's like thrown out the window, as we don't, we'll just figure it out. And it's pretty easy, if you get on a SimpliVity box, for example, when you sit down, you're like, wow, this is VMware, right? But the truth is that it is VMware, but it's got a lot of little twists, right? And you can back yourself into a corner that's really hard to get out of later without the proper training and due diligence and planning up front, right? Once again, that's an area where a company like Vologys can really help you, right? We'll work directly with our SimpliVity partners, for example, and we can do that design with you, so that we're doing a lot of those designs like now. If you're going to do a SimpliVity install, for example, that's going to be the first one you've ever done, right? So, don't get caught up in the fact that, wow, it looks like and smells like, VMware, so I can just do it. So that's probably the first thing. The second thing is that, the converged infrastructure can really be misconceived as a panacea, right? it can be misconceived as, something where I can just get rid of everything else I have, right? Or I just want to run my whole network on it. And the truth is that that's not really what it's for, right? It's for specific places. It's for places where, you want to get rid of a lot of old disparate parts and get down to less disparate parts, right? And I think that's another misconception that we've seen. And then, finally, I would say is that, the customers that we've seen that have done it really, really like the box. The one thing that they do walk away from, probably feeling that they didn't quite understand as much going in order to run and gain all the efficiencies of convergence on a machine, say like a CN 2000 or CN 3000 SimpliVity machine, is that a portion of, let's say, for example, the RAM and compute inside of that box is used by the SimpliVity virtual machine that's doing all that great stuff for you, right? So if you buy a 256 gig box, let's say, there's a certain portion of that RAM that's going to go to do all that auto tiering your data, right? To do all those overhead,
right?
And that's one thing that people get a little bit wrapped around. So that's why we invite people here to Vology. We bring them to our Solution Center lab, or we even do POCs on site, right? So we can make sure that the sizing is correct and that we've really thought through, the way the installation and the deployment's going to go, so that hopefully, by beginning with the end in mind, we don't run into these types of issues.
So, I think that this is a good opportunity for us to sort of wrap this up. Dan, I can't thank you enough for setting the time aside. I know that you've probably received somewhere around 120 emails just in the amount of time you've been on this with us. So I greatly appreciate you setting the time aside to get on and have this discussion with us. And Kevin, the same to you. I really appreciate it as always. We thank you for gracing us with your beautifulness. And what I want to do is tell you guys about.
Respected for my mind.
We'll work on that. We're not there yet. So,
actually, and I don't mean to cut you off, but before we get into the closing statements, I definitely wanted to touch on what Dan was just saying. As far as planning for your CI infrastructure, definitely make sure that you do your diligences and that you do your homework, that you're checking into everything, and that you fully understand what your C-level suite or whomever is pushing these initiatives down upon you, fully understand what they expect the environment to be doing, what they expect the environment to be supporting, and make sure that you go through and that you do your diligences and that you size everything right and that you look into all the caveats. And of course, there's there's guys like me that do this day in and day out. So if you do run into a challenge, reach out to a friend. It gives us purpose. That's why we're here. Again, a stitch in time saves 9, and it's always better to measure twice and cut once.
Oh, that's a good one. So let me wrap this up. Kevin, thanks for the insight. And I think we all know that that's probably some of the wisest, right? I mean, you could sum up Dan's comments with that too, to some degree. If you have any doubt at all, make sure that you do have the right trusted advisor in place, whether it's a friend that's working in their environment or whether it's a VAR that you have a close enough relationship with. And if you don't, then you should be reaching out to Vology, because that's what our relationships are like. So we've got 3 more of these coming, guys. I'm very excited to go over each one of them, to host each one of them. One of them will be the SimpliVity technologies, which are, of course, very exciting. SimpliVity offers some very unique values associated with their solution that obviously or warrant a discussion. Same thing with Nutanix. They have some of their own caveats that bring a great deal of value, and as Dan said, they use GFS, which is something I think a lot of IT departments are very interested in evaluating, and that's just one little piece, not to take away from the value that comes with each one of these. And then thirdly, we're going to get a visit from some of the folks at HP. For those of you that maybe want to try to design your own converged, infrastructure and utilize OEM hardware and sort of design your solution from the inside out. Sometimes that can be a lot of labor, right? You can spend a lot of time designing that. It sort of waves in the face of this simplicity of bolt-on boxes that some of these other disruptive players offer. But then again, there's some values in baking your own as well, right?
It's the right solution for you.
Right, and you can kind of make it tight and right. And I think that's one. Hopefully, we'll have a customer on board that'll be able to give some illustration on some of their experiences with SimpliVity and Nutanix and with HP as well. So, folks. From those of us over here in sunny Tampa, we certainly appreciate your time for spending some time to get to know Vology and learn a little bit, hopefully, about convergence. And we hope that you folks can tune in next time so that we can go over some of the more intricate details associated with each of those vendors. Until next time, folks, thanks a lot, and I'll see you on the other side. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us at Vologys WireSide Chats. I'm your host, Neil Teresiano. Today's topic is going to be on converged infrastructure. It's going to be part of a four-part series. First one's going to be a high overview, 50,000-foot view of convergence. We're going to define it and talk about some of the ways that an IT department might apply that into their infrastructure. And then the other three are going to be with some of what Vology finds to be key players in the convergence universe, so to speak. So if I may, let me take a moment to introduce you to a few of our subject matter experts. One of them you may have met before, the world famous and quite possibly the world's most beautiful engineer, Kevin Reynolds. Kevin, how are you today?
I'm fantastic, Neil. Eddie didn't put all the big bright lights shining directly in my face today, so I'm very, very happy about that.
We're just as happy.
So
also who joins me is the world's busiest director at Vology. I may have offended a few directors at Vology with that one, but I know that Dan Patrick is a very busy man. Dan, thank you for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about what you do here at Vology?
Thanks, Neil. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Dan Patrick. I'm the Director of Technical Services here at Vology, and I pretty much run our field engineering teams that focus on networking, virtualization, and storage every single day. So I'm excited to be a part of this amazing new technology conversation that we're having today.
That's great. Dan joins us. Dan, you've been with us for how long now?
I joined Vology about the beginning of March, so it's about 5 months. But in Vology time, that's dog years. So let's see, it's at least 2 years now. So we kind of work what we call intergalactic days around here. They last 37 hours, and that's because we're doing whatever it takes.
That the gear takes, where we can end up doing more with less, essentially. Again, a byproduct of convergence. And I mean, more importantly, I think from a business perspective, for the business owners out there, the increased agility that it gives an IT department, an ability for you to essentially consume any other form of business and turn them on or turn them up almost immediately, or change the direction of your business or even change your strategy without ripping and replacing an entire data center. So let's go back to the first piece, which is sprawl. Kevin, I think you're probably a good person. I think every day you battle sprawl, right? Dan, I'm sure you battle a little sprawl yourself. I think we've recently had an engagement where we had customers with somewhere around 30 or 40 different vendors that were sitting in their rack. That's an old problem now, right? Right, Kevin? So how would you describe the problem of sprawl, and how does convergence solve that for a customer? And down a few paths that will lead to the marketing term, but in the end, it's all leading to the same place, right? Hence the word to converge. And if I may move on, we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the things that convergence tends to resolve as well, right? As we move through this, we're going to talk about how convergence provides value, what the stated value of convergence is, as well as some of the things that some of the manufacturers out there, especially the disruptive ones, are sort of changing the way that we do IT. So essentially, some of the major things that we talk about with convergence, or the problems we solve, are they reduce sprawl, which we're going to have Kevin comment on here in a moment. And then there's also the reduced cost of management, because things become a little simpler. And then there's also the other piece where we can gain some function, both in the amount of space.
Thanks for our customers every single day.
Yes, certainly. I know I've spent countless hours in your office with Kevin as well, doing a lot of really neat stuff for our customers. So we're excited to get this thing moving as we get to our new era of Vology, right?
Absolutely.
So what I wanted to do was just sort of start off with a simple understanding or definition of convergence, right? Because we can talk about convergence in a lot of ways. What we've got to be careful about is whether we're using a marketing term or a buzzword or what we actually mean, right? So what I wanted to do is at least go over the definition of convergence. That part at least remains the same, which is essentially bringing many parts to one, right? So that's all really convergence is. Now we've got a lot of things that we're going to talk about here in the next 50 minutes or so that will give us into a little bit more of the detail, and of course by default we're going to end up going